Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Forum. Thank you so much for being here. Just make your way into the sanctuary and we'll get started in a few minutes. A few quick announcements for you. Don't forget, next week we'll have our follow-up UCCS student-led panel discussion, our post-JWW discussion as we do every year, and that'll be right here as well. So you won't want to miss that. Have you all enjoyed Chris Hedges, everyone? He's been wonderful. Also, another quick announcement, we do still have Chris's books for sale in the Founders Room, so grab your copies before you run out of time.
You've written books. I guess I didn't realize that.
So I'm going to get out of the way and turn it over to Chris Hedges and our pastor, Leanne.
Oh, thanks.
So your busy weekend is almost over.
It's been great to be in a real church. It's good.
Yeah,
Aren't a lot left, frankly.
You know, over these past few days, I have heard you address all kinds of questions and many, many questions. Now I get a little turn to ask you a few. And what I have in mind is just asking Chris some questions about his personal faith and the role it plays in his life. And then most of the time will be open for your questions, because it's not often that we get a chance to speak with someone like you, and it's a great gift to us. Some of these things we talked about. I took him to Adam's Mountain Cafe on Friday. He liked it. I got the man's plate, and Chris got oatmeal. So I'm a person who is really very interested in how a person's faith comes into play, how they understand it, what it means to them. And you and I talked about this a little bit, but I wonder if you could share something of what your childhood was like growing up in the church.
So my father was a Presbyterian minister and a veteran of World War II. My mother was a professor, but also had a seminary degree and met my father at seminary. So I got it both barrels. They were part of the, they came out of that tradition of the social gospel. They were, in particular, my father was very involved in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, and as I told Leanne, my uncle was gay and had been disowned by all of the family except my father. And so Jamie and Arthur were part of our family. I told Leanne I was so clueless, I didn't actually realize that they were gay until I was 14.
My uncle's friend.
I just thought they were good friends.
Well, they were good friends,
they were,
probably.
They were. And my father was fierce in terms of gay rights because he had seen how painful it had been to his brother, who he loved very much. Mm-hmm. And so my father had a large church in Syracuse, and I went to Colgate, which is an hour away as an undergrad. And my dad there was no gay and lesbian organization, so my father brought the gay speakers to campus. And he was very vocal on a national level in terms of full equality, marriage, ordination for the GBLT community. I think I remember, this was in the 70s, so I think I remember him telling me there were only 7 other Presbyterian clergy who publicly spoke out on this issue. And then my father kept telling the students they had to form an organization so that people could, find a kind of community. Football and frats are very big at Colgate, and so one day my father drove down, took me to lunch, and told me that I had to found it. So I did. I founded, I never went, but
Nice.
I founded the Gay Alliance, it was called, at Colgate. Had my name on it, C. Hedges, every
Yay.
Tuesday night. And I would go into the dining hall, and the guy would take my card to check it off for the meal and hand it back and go, faggot. Eventually, the church came down heavy on my father and told him that he was no longer allowed to speak publicly about this issue, and instead my father held an Easter service for the GBLT community in Syracuse, and he drove down. He was a great preacher, and he drove down and got me. He said, I want you to come because this is the last time you'll ever hear me preach. Sorry. And he got up and he said, marriage is a sacrament. It's not a reward for being a heterosexual. And any church that does not honor the sacrament of marriage, any church that does not honor the sacrament of marriage cannot call itself Christian. And they threw him out. And he was, he ended up working as a chaplain in a juvenile detention home. But that was really seismic for me, because I don't believe that you can teach morality. I think you have to show it. And years later, I had been the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times and was publicly very outspoken on a national level, Charlie Rose, all these kinds of shows, against the invasion of Iraq. It was a very difficult position to take. In the wake of 9/11, I would come into the New York Times and my phone bank would be filled with death threats, and the reason there weren't more is because they ran out of space. I was booed off of a commencement stage for denouncing the war. I was lynched by the right-wing media, Fox News, Every Hour, Rush Limbaugh. The New York Times called me in and issued me a formal written reprimand to stop speaking out about the war. And that's under guild or union rules. When you give the employee a written reprimand and they continue to violate, then you can fire them. And as I sat in that office, I'm not going to pretend it was easy, it was hard, I realized I had a choice. And that choice was I could pay fealty to my career, but to do so would be to betray my father. And I couldn't do it. And when I walked out of the building, my career was over. I realized that what my father had given me was freedom. I didn't need the New York Times to tell me who I was. I knew I was my father's son. You know, sometimes we talk about resurrection. Sorry.
No, go for it. Thank you for your tears.
We talk about resurrection, and I always say, it's my voice, but it's my father's words. You know, in the prison, every class, my final class, I always cry. Sorry. I try not to. The last class, one of my students said, "Are you going to cry again?" I mean, I hated it. I said, no, I'm going to try and wait till you leave.
Well, you don't know this, but they will know that they're very familiar with that. I'm a big crier myself. I cried when I was reading you the prayer shawl prayer, for heaven's sake. In our conversation, I was struck by how different our religious paths have been, because you were raised with social gospel.
Yeah.
And I was raised evangelical, Bible church. And if I had to sum up the meaning of Christianity in one sentence, as I was taught as a child, it would be like, God sent Jesus to die for my sin, and if I accept that, then that sacrifice, then I get to go to heaven. How would you sum up your childhood faith of what, in one sentence, what kind of Christianity was taught to you?
That Jesus called us to stand unequivocally with the crucified of the earth, even if that meant we too were crucified.
Yeah. Those are very different messages, and they formatively shape lives, don't they? Yeah.
I've never deviated from it. I've never, all my life, what I was rooted in my childhood, I've never strayed from it. I went to cover war, but I always I was a journalist, but I put myself consciously in situations of extreme distress to give a voice to people who were, when I got to El Salvador, the death squads were killing between 700 and 1,000 people a month. I was in Gaza for 7 years. I was in Sarajevo. Was always to use my journalism as a weapon to write about the oppressed. And my good friend at the New York Times, Stephen Kinzer, in exasperation once said, you know, you're not a journalist, you're just a minister pretending to be a journalist.
I'm going to fix your little microphone
okay,
here, because you can kind
All
of
right,
bend
no,
this
thanks.
part of it down.
But you know, great preachers, like great journalists, tell the truth. And they tell the truth a lot of people don't want to hear. I was a journalist a long time. And I can, what we do for a living is manipulate facts. I can take a set of facts and spin a story any way you want. And if I'm a careerist, I'm going to spin it to my advantage. But if I tell the truth, I'm going to make sure I use those facts to tell the truth. But I think that's also true with great preachers. I watched, as a kid, it was a very impactful moment. I watched people walk out of my father's congregation over his opposition to the Vietnam War. He actually told me, as a kid, and he dragged me off to he was part of Concerned Clergy and Laity Against the War, founded by the Berrigans, and so we went to all sorts of anti-war demonstrations. But he told me if I was 18 and the war was still being fought, he would go to prison with me. I still have a vision of sitting for 2 years in a jail cell with my dad, but...
In Christianity, an explicit message in Christianity is to love your enemies, do good to those who persecute you. Of course, it's not exclusive to Christianity, but in the context of the church, I'll speak about Christianity. Is that a naive strategy in this day and age? For you, where does love fall into your personal motivation, and how do you respond lovingly in situations like you've just described?
It's possible to carry out that admonition when people don't have power, even people who've committed evil. But once people have power, one has to understand how malignant and how destructive that power is, and one has to fight it. We're not fighting the person as vile and as I find Trump. We are fighting the power itself. And one can't confuse that imperative to stand up for justice in the face of power with loving the people who are, wielding forces of oppression.
I'll ask one more question, and then we'll turn it over, so be ready with your own. Actually, two more questions. I think in your talk yesterday, you made the comment that politics is a game of fear. And do you consider religion to be that, as it's been historically lived out?
As a game of fear? Well, it is the way you grew up.
Yeah.
But not the way I grew up.
Yeah.
In my book, American Fascists, I call the Christian right heretics. And I think part of our failing is not standing up for the gospel. On its most basic level, Jesus didn't come to make us rich. And you don't need to suffer through 3 years of Harvard Divinity School to figure it out. He didn't come to bless the American nation or the white race. Jesus wasn't white. Jesus was a person of color. The Romans were white. Jesus was undocumented. The gospel itself, I think, is quite unequivocal in terms of its stance on the side of the oppressed. I just don't think there's any way around it, despite some things by Paul. But that's not the gospel, that's Paul. And as you know, the Christian right grounds themselves in Paul. The Beatitudes, they might as well not exist. Mm-hmm. So I think we failed by in the name of tolerance, a word Martin Luther King never used, we in that kind of that our attitude gave them a kind of religious legitimacy they should not have. And we're watching it now. We're watching them destroy our country. We're watching them slash. I mean, they slashed Meals for Wheels. I mean, that's sick.
Yeah.
Head Start. I mean, these are not big programs. They're ripping out programs that sustain the poorest, most vulnerable people among us. This isn't Christian.
No.
And now I think, I think it's time for us to stand up and for the Christian gospel. But of course, if we do, they're going to come at us. They already hate us, as you know. I mean, we're all not Christians in their eyes. We're not what they call it, nominal Christians, I think is the term, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that was our failing. It is not understanding that we had to go out into the world and fight for the radical message of the gospel.
I feel like we've spent time together. I feel like you're my friend, and I worry about you.
You and my wife.
Yeah. You've spoken a few times about the value of the essential nature of community and of music. You've talked about music. And I wonder, what are the communities in which you find nurture and support? And what music feeds your soul?
Gospel music. I was very good friends with Julian Assange and fought for Julian for 14 years, visited him in the embassy, went to London, covered all his court cases, was one of 6 people invited to his wedding at Belmarsh Prison. The prison authorities didn't let me in, but I was outside the gate, it didn't matter. We did a service in Oslo, Norway, at a decommissioned church, and the actor Liv Ullmann, Bergman,
Sure.
She read the scripture, and I gave the sermon. I did wear a clerical collar. It was called The Crucifixion of Julian Assange, and we had the best jazz band in Norway. It was gorgeous music. And they played gospel songs. So I go to, as I told you, I go to a church in Trenton. It's not heavy on the kind of Presbyterian intellectualism I grew up with, and that I actually like, but I just can't. There's a wonderful passage in Boswell's biography of Samuel Johnson. So every time Samuel Johnson would go to church, he'd just come away so enraged because he'd be critiquing the sermon. That's kind of my experience in the wealthy churches in Princeton, including when they were reading the passage that you have to give everything to the poor. This is a very wealthy church. And they put barrels up in front of the church, and then all white, all the children walked up and gave a gift to the poor children of Trenton. That was it for me. I couldn't quite deal with that. It's not about charity, it's about justice. I think that's what Jesus is trying to say. And so I go to a church in Trenton, and I love the pastor. She's wonderful. It is technically a Presbyterian church. She's from Puerto Rico. Her father was a Pentecostal minister. I don't know how she gets away with it, because it is totally a Pentecostal church. It's like, which I kind of like. I mean, It's like everybody's standing and waving and screaming amen, and the music is great, and it's also, I would probably guess maybe 60-70% is black, and then Latino. Aren't very many whites. There's some, but it's inclusive. So unlike Pentecostal churches, they have GBLTQ members, and it's kind of but I go there, and I'm going to be honest. I mean, I'm worried. From my personal, I've been so fierce against the genocide, and have for so many years spoken out on behalf of the Palestinians, and I have I have a big platform. I just did an interview with Al Jazeera that has 1.6 million views. And I'm on the list. I know it, and we watch what they're doing. And I'm not going to pretend I'm not going to stop, but it's called bearing the cross, and it's not easy. It's not easy. And maybe everything will be fine, but maybe it won't.
Well, we talked about in the Bible, again and again, in the communities that are described in the Bible, the message is that empire wins.
Yeah, they always win.
It's not a feel-good message.
No.
But our task is to learn how to live within that paradigm and to seize the value of living well.
Yeah. Solzhenitsyn writes about in the Gulag Archipelago, which is, if you haven't read it, it's really a remarkable book, and don't read the abridged, read all 3 volumes. Because it's a meditation on power, it's just an absolutely stunning book. But he writes about the 2 groups in the gulags that are able to endure the horrific abuse and oppression, and that are the Christians and the Chechens, by which he means the Muslims, because they're untouched by the communist ideology. They're willing to accept self-sacrifice, and they drive the guards insane because their loyalty and fealty is grounded in faith, even a faith that tells them that they may have to sacrifice themselves. And in a way, I think I can't remember if he actually uses those words, but I think what he says is that they're the only people in the gulags who are free. So I think that, but it is community. Community is key. It's always key. I mean, I remember shortly before Dan Berrigan died, and he kind of saw it all coming, and he said, look, all we have left now is our community or our church and the Eucharist. And that will sustain us. Berrigan was very, very, very close to Thomas Merton. And it's interesting, he said that in many ways, he was very close to his brother Phil Berrigan, but he said in many ways the death of Merton affected him even more deeply than Phil, or certainly as much. And, Merton was contemplative in a way that Berrigan wasn't. But Berrigan, who often would make trips down to Merton's monastery, it was Gethsemane, right? It was called.
Kentucky.
Yeah, but he spent months there. And Merton actually objected to the Berrigan's decision to go into Catonsville, take out the draft records and burn them. I don't.
Oh, did he?
I'm with Berrigan. I don't. But there's a wonderful story Dan told me that he was in his, I think he died when he was about 94, but he was in his early 90s, and he had to go in for a pretty serious operation. And the surgeon came and said, "Are you the Daniel Berrigan?" And Berrigan goes, "Oh, man, oh, no." And the surgeon said, "You burned my draft record, you saved my life, and now,
Oh, wow.
and now I'm going to save yours."
Wow. What a cool story.
He was also, like you and Jim, who has a very impish sense of humor, which I love. He was also very funny, Berrigan.
So who has questions? Rob, do we have mics? Well, that didn't take long.
Hi. This may actually be a really personal question, so you can feel free not to answer it. Obviously, you went to Harvard Divinity School, and but in 2014, you were ordained in the Presbyterian Church, and you obviously spent several years between receiving your MDiv and then being ordained in the church. What caused you to choose ordination in the church?
So I never rejected ordination. I went before my committee after finishing divinity school, and they asked me what my call was. And I said, I'm going to El Salvador to be a freelance reporter and cover the war, of which there was a long silence. And then the head of the committee said, we don't ordain journalists. That was their decision, not mine. And my poor dad was outside, and I had to go out and tell him I wasn't going to get ordained. And my father said, you're ordained to write. I never rejected ordination, they did. And when I came back, I lost my job for the New York Times. So it wasn't just losing my job, I was blacklisted. I at that point, was not going to be hired by any journalistic publication. I was done. And all my friends from the divinity school, because I lost my health insurance, got me health insurance through the Presbyterian Church, and then in the charming ways of institutional bureaucracy, somebody noticed that I wasn't ordained and said they were going to take it away. So I don't remember much. The ordination exams, as Leanne knows, in Presbyterian are really 40% failure rate for people who graduate from seminary. They're really awful. But I went to the Princeton University Library and just retaught myself everything, took the exams, and passed them. And because at the time I had been teaching in the prison, and that is a call without question. I look at it that way. And then I wasn't going to have the ordination service in Princeton at these churches. No, they wouldn't have liked it anyway. And so we did it in an inner city church in Elizabeth, New Jersey. We threw out the Presbyterian hymnals. We got a blues band. We invited all of the families of my students from the prison. And it's actually online, which you should watch. It's beautiful. And Cornel West spoke, and James Cone gave the sermon. And it is the only ordination sermon James Cone ever gave. And I remember, it was, we were very close friends. I admire him tremendously. And, he showed up. I knew what it meant. Cornell said there are a lot of really angry black preachers who've asked James Cone to do it, and he won't. And my wife, who is an actor and went to Juilliard, I teach in the Supermax prison, but there's no college. So I teach in the college degree program through Rutgers, but they won't allow it into the Supermax prison because, in the words of the administrator who runs the prison, it's a waste of time because they're all going to die in here anyway. So I have, throughout the years, just created my own courses, bought the books myself, gone in and taught a full semester course, which doesn't have academic credit, but I give them, if they finish it, I print out a certificate which goes into their file, which they can use before the parole board. I actually taught a student at East Jersey State about a year ago, and he showed up, and he still had the certificate that I'd given to him. So I got this really clever idea that I was going to get 6 Rutgers professors, and we were going to teach all summer, and then all of them dropped out. It's a headache to teach in you don't get rewarded for it at the university. They treat you like garbage at the prison. So I recruited my son, who was a graduate student at Columbia, and my wife, and I said, okay, you guys are teaching this. So she taught poetry writing, and she had a very talented poet. And if you watch that YouTube video, if you just write Chris Hedges Ordination in YouTube, she read the poems, which are devastating. But when she got up to read the poems, she walked up in combat boots, fishnet stockings, a black mini skirt, and a tank top. And remember, we had all the synod administrators in horror sitting in the back row. And she said, I wore my best Presbyterian minister's wife's outfit. She also, at the end of the show, so we had the blues band was wonderful, and they did Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and the singer does like a shuffle, a dance, what do they call that, a soft shoe shuffle, and he starts dancing, and Eunice jumped up from the pew and started dancing with him in front of the church, and then she brought me like this, and so the end of my ordination are us dancing in front of the church. It was beautiful, except the minister, who was a classmate of mine, heard the synod executives walk out and go, I have never been to an ordination. But I'll tell you, it was real. It was really moving. Yeah, it was beautiful.
Chris. Hello? Oh, okay. So we thank you so much for coming. Many of us have participated in book studies. Oh my gosh, it's a thrill having you with us, and your bravery, your exemplary life, it's just We admire that,
Oh, thanks.
as your father would have too. My question is, with all the news sources, which ones do you trust or recommend to us to listen to?
So in terms of the Middle East, Al Jazeera, they do, you can't trust them on Qatar, but you can trust them on Gaza. So I've actually done quite a bit of broadcasting on Al Jazeera. I've been flown twice to Qatar since the genocide began to do broadcasting on both Arabic and the English Al Jazeera channel. But yeah, I think Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, Munda Weiss, Electronic Intifada, those are all, if you want to follow the genocide, they are all very, very good. I read traditional news sources, but I'm a journalist, so I know how to read them. I think the New York Times coverage on some things is good. I think their coverage of the campus protests and the genocide is an abomination. I really, really blame the traditional press for laying the groundwork for these assault against the universities by falsely demonizing these groups as anti-Semitic and supporting Hamas. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I know because I spent significant time at Columbia, at the encampment, and at Princeton. And as I was telling Leanne, on Friday nights they would spread out a tarp, and the Muslim students would do their prayers, and then they would hold Shabbat on the same tarp. Well, that's the world we want to create, not destroy. And the way that these universities acquiesce to this false charge of anti-Semitism, I mean, Ruha Benjamin, a scholar I admire immensely at Princeton, is teaching on probation. This is insane. And what they did is give credibility to this assault. Now you're seeing the universities and everyone else acknowledge that this is a subterfuge on the part of, and of course, the irony is that these far-right groups are anti-Semites. I mean, Elon Musk gave the Nazi salute. And let's be clear, and there was a wonderful headline in a German newspaper because he said, oh, it wasn't really enough. And the headline was, a Nazi salute is a Nazi salute is a Nazi salute. These guys are white Aryan neo-Nazis. And if you look at the Christian right, their foundational ideologues, Rousas Rushdoony, and I read it was taken from Calvin, but his Institutes of Biblical Law, he's a terrible writer. It was just torturous. But read it. I mean, we won't need prisons because recidivists will be executed. I mean, women are completely stripped of any role in society other than catering to men and bearing children. And Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt was a legal scholar who was the leading Nazi legal theorist. They openly admire Schmitt and Rushdoony, who was a Nazi. He was Armenian, but he was a Nazi sympathizer. That's what's happening. And the press is, still to this day, I read an article the other day in the Times talking about the encampments, that they harassed Jewish students. Okay, maybe a few Jewish students were harassed. But let's be clear, the persecution was directed at those who stood up against the genocide. 100 students at Columbia were arrested. The administration called the police onto the campus 3 different times. People have been suspended, expelled, including administrators, faculty. And so, I really think the press has failed us. But I do read the Times, I listen to the BBC, I read the Israeli newspaper Aretz. I'm a news junkie. You don't want to spend as many hours as I do reading news. Those are,
Thank you so much for being here this weekend, and your message of stepping into the resistance and taking action is powerful and necessary. The first 2 times you spoke, I heard a lot about labor taking a major role in being able to disrupt the machine. And today I heard that every act of defiance adds to our cause, and I appreciate that. I'm curious your thoughts on economic boycotts. When I play around with 70% of our economy is consumerism, I heard Walmart and and Amazon batted around yesterday. So how effective do you think that can be And I keep playing the Tesla history that's been made in the last 2 months. So talk a little bit about economic boycott, please.
I'm a strong supporter of the BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction movement against Israel, and have been from its inception. Partly because I don't believe in violence. I'm in a funny position because, having spent so much time in Gaza, I actually knew quite well one of the co-founders of Hamas, Dr. Abdelaziz Rantisi, and I, having been in Sarajevo, understand that people can be pushed to a point by which they employ violence. But violence for me is always tragic. It's never just. I don't believe in just war theory. So I think economic boycotts, that was very important in terms of going after the apartheid regime of South Africa. The problem is if they're too diffuse, people can't follow them. So I think we, like with Chavez, when we went after the grape, they would go after specific produce companies. So I think if we keep it specific, I think they're very effective. You've watched the spontaneous boycott of Tesla, which is great. May we all get rid of Teslas if we have them and not buy more.
My question is a follow-up, and thank you for being here, Chris. I'm thinking about, we're all, I think at this time, looking for effective strategies, and I have been reflecting on the danger of the surveillance capitalism type thing we're all under. But then I think about the potential of boycotts and see that our immediate connection and our data points and all that stuff, it can be a danger to our movement, but maybe it can help us move quickly as well. So comments on strategies in this time of corporate surveillance. First question, and second one was, where do you see the role of youth? Like Friday night, there were a lot of us, white hairs there, and just wondering out there in the world of youth, what's happening?
Right. So I spent a lot of time in Zuccotti during the Occupy movement. I spent quite a bit of time at the encampment at Princeton. And I think that for those of us who come out of a church tradition, we've got to give up on this silly idea that we're going to bring youth into the church. We got to go to them. And that's what I do. And I oftentimes was telling, like in Zuccotti, so every time we did a lot of teach-ins in Zuccotti, but I would consciously give sermons. I once gave a talk in Zuccotti, and I can guarantee you 90% of these kids have never been in a church or a synagogue, called "Where Were You When They Crucified My Lord?" And began with "Where Were You When They Crucified Matthew Shepard?" So I brought that question of the gospel into their contemporary reality. And as I told Leanne over breakfast, these experiences, they're hungry for it. They want to hear it. Every time I do it, it would be complete silence. But we got to go to them. That's the first thing. That is my church. There's so much of this is on YouTube, including an event I did with 133 veterans, some Vietnam vets, but a lot of vets from the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. We were all arrested in front of the White House under Obama, protesting the wars, and which is also on YouTube. And that, again, was a sermon, when I spoke, ending with the great end of W.H. Auden's September 1st, 1939. Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them of eros and of dust, show an affirming flame. So I don't blame the kids for not coming to church. I think we failed them. And the other rule I have is that when they make a decision about civil disobedience, even if I disagree with it, I join them. So the kids made a plan to occupy an administrative building on Princeton's campus. I have taught at Princeton, but wasn't teaching this year, so I'm trespassing. I have no Princeton ID, and they asked me to join them, and I agreed. And it turns out that at the last minute, they decided not to do it that day, And the day they did it, I was in Washington. I wasn't in Princeton, but I would have joined them. I was arrested in front of Goldman Sachs with the occupiers when we shut down. Cornel West and I held a people's hearing of Goldman Sachs, where Goldman Sachs is a huge realtor in New York, and we brought in families that have been evicted and condemned Goldman Sachs for throwing these people onto the street and forcing them to be unhoused. And then Cornell didn't go with me. He didn't want to get arrested, but I went with the kids. And there's a picture, and I got to get it. It's a picture of me in my Brooks Brothers button-down shirt and a tweed jacket, completely surrounded by people who are tattooed and pierced. We all went to jail together. I think it's so imperative. I think it's so important. And I did wear a clerical today, but I don't wear it usually, obviously. But like on May 1st, when we have this rally to keep ICE out of Princeton, I will wear it, and because I want to be identified as a Christian. And in the prison, most of my students are Muslim. 80% are Muslim. And I'm not trying to bring them to Jesus. I have a tremendous respect for Islam. I'm an Arabic speaker, but I want to show them what it means to be a Christian. I don't preach at them, but they know. And I told that story, I guess it was at dinner the other night, with this student who was 14. Both of his parents were dead. He was living in Camden, which per capita is the poorest city in America, in an abandoned house. He couldn't read or write. He's picked up by the cops, forced to sign a confession for a rape and a murder he did not commit, told if he signs it, he can go home. He gets to court, and here's what he's charged with. He weighs 90 pounds. He's trying to protest, and he's sentenced as an adult, only in America, and then he's not eligible for parole until he's 70 years old. I mean, this is just an abomination. And so he was taught to read in prison, the GED program. It turns out he's brilliant. He was one of my very few A students. And when after a class I taught, he came up to me and said, "I know I'm going to die in this prison, but I work as hard as I do because one day I'm going to be a teacher like you." So under a Supreme Court ruling called Miller, the Supreme Court ruled that children cannot be sentenced as if they're adults. But still, it was a 2-year legal process, which we initiated, but I became his guardian. We raised $20,000 to buy him, because they wouldn't, even if he got released, they wouldn't release him unless he had an address. So we got him an apartment, and all of my formerly incarcerated students filled my garage with a bed, it was great. And then we went to court, and they tell you the day, but they don't tell you when. So I went at 10, I wore a clerical collar, I sat all day in court. By 4 in the afternoon, I was the only one left, and it was clear that I'd come for Lawrence, and the sheriff's deputy opened the door and said, "Who the fuck is that minister?" And Lawrence said, "That's my pastor," and Lawrence is Muslim. And that's why I do what I do. I want them to see what it means to be. I'm not trying to make them Christians. I want them to see, but we're not going to do that unless we go to them. I just anecdotally from talking to people in the congregation, I think what keeps your church real is that you have enough people out there doing that. Once you think that you're going to build a church by walling yourself off, you're going to die. That's so many churches have. But my sense from talking to people here is that you have people in this congregation who go out and do the real work. And you still got to come here, because as things get worse and worse, this is how we're going to be sustained. But the soul of the church is not created in these pews. It's honored in these pews.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much for visiting us here. It's been a real pleasure to hear you speak. I have personally found that even though I want to speak peace and live peace and speak love and be love, it can be challenging at times to embody those things. And I'm wondering if you have any practices that help you align your actions, your behaviors, your tones, your choices with the ideas of love and peace.
Well, I mean, I can be a real son of a bitch. Especially, I mean, if you don't walk out of that prison classroom angry, you don't have a heart. And if you don't walk out of Gaza angry, you don't have a heart. So I am presentation with power because I have the ability to have a voice that is denied to Palestinians or denied to my students. And the power that I confront would not describe me as peaceful or loving. And that would be correct. So I think that, was that great gospel line, I come not to bring peace but a sword? I think that when we confront malignant power on behalf of those who are being crushed or standing with those who are being crushed, the peace, the love is expressed in the confrontation against injustice. And Augustine said that hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they don't remain the way they are. So, and having been up against malignant power, I covered the war in Bosnia, I covered the genocide in Bosnia. It was in the sermon. It was confrontation. Confrontation which had the potential to end my own life. 45 journalists were killed in Sarajevo. My photographer was wounded 2 days after I got there. 22 journalists were killed when I covered the war in Salvador. So I think our actions have to be grounded in love, and our actions have to be grounded in a desire for peace. But when we come up against let's call them what they are, the forces of death, we have to fight.
First, let me just say thank you for the church as well for introducing me to Chris Hedges. Sarah, it's been a pleasure to hear you speak and also be introduced to you. I wanted to ask you, when all of this is said and done, there is going to be a need for a severe amount of social change, far surpassing what Reconstruction was after the Civil War. What do you see with that social change taking shape, and what role do you see churches taking up when it comes to helping disarm people of these negative and hateful views?
Well, I would like to see the churches go back to the era of the social gospel, which was a conscious socialist movement. Remember, Eugene V. Debs spent a lot of time quoting the Bible. And I don't understand how, if we're enjoined to love our neighbor as ourself, we allow people to sleep on streets, or get locked in cages, or go to bed hungry, or get shot by police, or not have access to health care. I mean, we live in a system that is so perverted that parents are forced to bankrupt themselves while they try to save their ill sons or daughters. That's what that's about. That's sick. And I would like to see a conscious embrace of socialism, which was part, and that social gospel was taken down, like the radical movements, largely by Woodrow Wilson, who resegregated the federal government. And big money came in from Carnegie, Rockefeller, because they wanted to destroy the social gospel. And I was fortunate enough to grow up in a remnant of it. But I think that we have to be clear that we, as Christians, are driving to build a society that is not about that cult of the self, or that building a financial or whatever kind of monument to ourselves, but about our neighbor. I mean, part of the problem is that that whole "how is it with me" spirituality, I don't like. I think it's narcissistic. It's not, if there's anything that's clear, and Buber wrote a great book about it, is that it's not about us. I mean, not that we don't have struggles, and not that we aren't crippled as well, but it's what Jung calls the wounded healer. The ability, and Jung argues that it's those who have deep wounds that are able to minister to others who have those wounds, who are most effective in healing not only others, but themselves. So I'm very good friends with these really great radical feminists who run Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter in Vancouver, and they don't make it public, but there's a large percentage of these women who have suffered sexual abuse. And they spend their lives reaching out to, in particular, young women who are being prostituted on the east side, which is the poor area of Vancouver, most of whom, by the way, are indigenous. And they have dedicated their lives to taking the wounds that they have, reaching out to others who have those wounds and making them whole. I also see it with vets, because I spend a lot of time with Veterans for Peace, Iraq Veterans Against the War, and there you have some very traumatized and troubled people who, out of that trauma, are attempting to heal each other, because it's a very important community, but also oppose the war. So if you watch that YouTube video that someone made of us getting arrested, they're interviewing a lot of these vets who've just come back, and we're all against the fence of the White House getting arrested. And when we were arrested, and zip-tied with our hands behind our back, turns out that the Capitol Hill police, most of them are in the National Guard, and most of them had been in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they would whisper in our ears, "Keep protesting, these wars are no good." They still took us to jail, but...
Thank you, sir.
I have a question, and that is, how do you speak to your ideological opposites when they themselves are Christians and claim that you're not?
Two ways: humor, you can't, and empathy. You're not going to argue them out of it. I mean, they have retreated into magical thinking. And they have retreated into magical thinking because of a very real despair and a very real disenfranchisement from society. And the first chapter of my book, American Fascists, is called Despair. They are manipulated by these mega pastors and figures like Dobson. Their despair is manipulated. So, just as an example, I spent 2 years on the book, and I spent a lot of time with them. But I went to a Right to Life weekend in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and they asked all the post-abortive sisters to stand, about 400 women, which was the whole room. And then when I started interviewing the women, it turns out that many of them had had multiple abortions. And this is done by a group called Priests for Life. They would give these women dolls, and they would tell the women that these were their children that they had murdered, that they would have to sleep with the doll, bathe the doll, dress the doll, name the doll, and then at the end of the weekend, hold up the child that they were told they had murdered, and beg for forgiveness and vow to fight against the culture of death, which is us. That's just a small window into how I think these groups really cruelly, even sadistically, manipulate feelings of shame and guilt and remorse. So I do think that from spending a lot of time with them, we can have a real empathy for what many of them have undergone. I think they are part of a very dangerous fascistic movement, in terms of you're not going to argue them out of it. It's not. It's just not going to work. And I really think at that point, because I have to deal with hecklers sometimes, and I just use humor, you know. I'll use humor. I think that's kind of the best deflective mechanism, even if it's self-depreciating. I mean, self-depreciating humor is even more effective. So I would say those are the two ways.
Hi, thank you again for being with us today. I know I've learned so much and felt renewed conviction from it. So I teach journalism, and I'm a former journalist myself. And I'm wondering what advice you would have for young journalists or people who are aspiring to be journalists right now.
Well, it's tough because it's a dying profession. And that is because it's no longer commercially viable. Now with all the algorithms, they don't need news organizations to connect sellers with buyers. That was the monopoly that the New York Times had, for instance. So when Craigslist came out, 40% of newspaper revenue was classified ads. They lost almost 50% of their revenue. I think somebody asked me once to define what it means to be a journalist, I think it means holding power accountable. You can make a very good living as a stenographer to power. I know people at the New York Times who spent their whole careers doing that and won all sorts of journalistic prizes. But for me, that's propaganda. It's not journalism. Even though within establishment organizations like the New York Times, these people are highly valued because of access. They have access, and powerful media organizations like the New York Times care inordinately about access to the powerful, although as I.F. Stone said, they may know more than I do, I.F. Stone, the great iconoclast, but most of it's wrong. Like the whole I was part of the investigative team after 9/11. I was based in Paris, and I covered Al-Qaeda, and so the French did not want us to go into Iraq because they realized that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction, had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, et cetera. So at the very highest levels of the French government, I mean, I must have been out of the presidency, not because I'm a great reporter, but because I was with the New York Times, I had complete security clearance and could go in and ask for anything. I mean, there are things that I found out that to this day I've never written or made public. And the reason was they desperately wanted this information to be passed on to the American public to prevent us from the debacle that we went in. And I would go back periodically to New York and sit, and they would laugh off the French, even though I had documentation. They laughed it off in a racist kind of way. And they said, well, Louis Scooter Libby told us this, or Pearl told us this, or Cheney told us this. Well, they were all lies. But they prioritized those lies. So, yeah, I would say holding power to account, and I think we have to accept that at this point, if you're going to be an honest journalist, you're probably going to have another job, like a lot of ministers, in order to continue to do what you do, because it's not commercially viable. And while I'm here, you all should sign up for my Substack. And I'm telling anybody who doesn't have money, I don't put it behind a paywall. So if you actually just click no thanks, you'll still get everything. I do that because I have so many of my students from the prison who sign up, and I don't want to charge them. But if you can pay the $6 a month, pay it. But anyway, it has all of my shows, and it has all of my writing that you can get. And there's 2 shows, I think I said this the other night, that I would strongly, and you can just go on YouTube and watch them. One is the interview I did with the fascist scholar Jason Stanley at Yale, who has now left the country for Canada. And the other is with the great legal scholar Catherine Franke at Columbia Law School, who stood up against the persecution of the students. She herself is Jewish, again, and she was fired. But I think that if you watch Stanley, who's steeped in the understanding of fascism, and you watch Franke, who's steeped in legal scholarship, with those 2 interviews, you're going to get a very sobering and I think accurate picture of where we are in this country.
Do we have maybe one more question? I think time-wise, we're at 12:13, so.
This is similar to that. This is in reference to the discussion about the repression of speech on college campuses, Columbia specifically, but all of the. I'm sure you're familiar with Project Esther. These actions are play-by-play in line with Project Esther. And if you look at it, it is clearly designed to divide, to scapegoat Muslim people and to divide the Jewish community against itself. I can't believe that the New York Times isn't aware of this. Why are mainstream, and specifically the New York Times, but why is this not better known? Why is this not being talked about? Why are these institutions not making this public?
Careerism. When I denounced the calls to invade Iraq, there was no disagreement about how this was going to be a fiasco among all of us who covered the Middle East. But my colleagues were smart enough to keep their mouth shut. It's careerism. They know, look, it takes very hard to get a job at the New York Times. And when you get it, many people need that imprimatur. It becomes part of their identity. And there are no rules written on the walls, but you know it's probably not a good idea to call up and interview Noam Chomsky for a story. So you don't do it. And you know it's not a good idea to take on the Zionist lobby. Not good for your career, so they don't do it. And to what extent some of the reporters may convince themselves, I don't know. But the New York Times is a very careerist story, as are all the big, powerful media organizations, and I think it's careerism. And those people who are willing to defy and when you, so for instance, when I was overseas and I was on the ground, so I mean, I did the grunt work. I hardly ever interviewed heads of state. I had to do some of it, which I didn't like. Although I interviewed Gaddafi, which was kind of interesting, and Arafat, several times. But I would be, the Israelis would bomb Jabalia to habitually destroy a bomb-making factory. I would go to Jabalia, I would count the bodies. But it wasn't just the Israelis you would fight, it was the Washington Bureau. Because all those reporters in Washington, they made their living by doing lunch, by having access, by being lied to. And so it was incumbent upon them to try and discredit often my stories. And in the name of balance, you would get what I had reported off the ground, and then you would get the official version, which was a lie. And they would give them equal weight. So, I mean, you could just believe whatever you want to believe. But it's careerism, I mean, and cynical. I mean, you'll see it on TV where they'll throw up some, Yahoo Trump supporter and someone from the Democratic Party. And I'm sure many of these news celebrity hosts, I don't like to call them journalists, because if you make $10 million, I can assure you you're not a journalist a year. And I think they know they're both lying, and they don't. And that's really an abandonment of journalism. But as long as they give, one side equal time and the other side, that's not journalism. That's vaudeville. Yeah, it's the rot within journalism. And if you do, I mean, those of us who, we're admittedly always management headaches without question. But as the journalistic enterprises have suffered commercially, they've become more and more cautious, and because their fundamental goal is not to lose advertisers. And so there's less and less space for people like myself within those organizations.
Shall we show Chris a little appreciation
Okay,
for
thanks
this
for coming.
weekend? He gave us a benediction, a blessing for worship. Let's send him off one. I invite you to raise your hand toward this beautiful man. May God bless you and keep you. May the face of God shine on you, and may God give you peace. Amen. You bet.